precisely 6 p.m. on September 17th, the state of Florida is set to carry out the execution of David Joseph Pittman, a 63-year-old man whose name has been etched into the state's long and violent history of capital punishment. His fate was sealed once more after Governor Ron DeSantis signed the official death warrant, bringing closure to a case that began more than 3 decades ago. In 1991, Pittman was convicted of one of the most chilling crimes Polk County had ever witnessed: the stabbing deaths of his estranged wife's parents and younger sister in the midst of a bitter divorce battle. This execution holds weight far beyond Pittman's personal story. It marks Florida's 10th execution of the year, the 12th death warrant issued in 2025, and a continuation of the state's record-breaking pace of capital punishment. The reason they were killed was not random, nor was it the result of a robbery gone wrong. The slaughter inside the Gantz household was born of something far more personal: rage, humiliation, and vengeance. At the center of this tragedy stood their estranged son-in-law, David Joseph Pittman, a man whose marriage had collapsed under the weight of bitterness and resentment. His relationship with the Gantz's daughter had deteriorated into hostility, and divorce proceedings had ripped apart whatever fragile peace remained. Pittman believed the Gantz family had orchestrated his downfall, that they had turned his wife against him and stripped him of both his pride and his future. When officers first entered the Gantz home in Bartow, they were confronted with a nightmare. Blood pooled across the carpet, furniture was overturned, and the victims lay where they had fallen in their final moments. Detectives immediately recognized that this was no random home invasion. The violence was too personal, too deliberate. Whoever had committed these murders had not come to steal valuables or escape unnoticed. They had come with one purpose: revenge. The investigation began with the obvious questions. Who would want the Gantz family dead? Detectives interviewed friends, neighbors, and extended relatives, and one name surfaced almost immediately: David Joseph Pittman. The estranged son-in-law had been spiraling. In the weeks before the murders, witnesses described him as unstable, consumed by anger toward his wife's family. He had been overheard making threats, and his bitterness during the divorce was no secret. To investigators, Pittman fit the profile of someone with both motive and opportunity. Physical evidence quickly reinforced those suspicions. Forensic teams discovered footprints and other indicators that pointed to Pittman's presence inside the home that night. There was no forced entry consistent with a stranger breaking in, which suggested the killer knew the victims and their routines. Detectives also traced Pittman's movements and found witnesses who had seen him near the Gantz residence shortly before the murders took place. Each piece of evidence was another thread tightening around him. As the pressure mounted, police brought Pittman in for questioning. Sitting across from detectives, he denied everything. He claimed he had no involvement, no knowledge of the killings, but investigators could see the cracks forming in his story. His alibi didn't hold. His explanations were vague, contradictory, and unconvincing. The more he tried to distance himself, the more his anger showed through. Detectives knew they had their man, they just needed to solidify the case. What truly sealed Pittman's fate was the combination of forensic detail and his own behavior. The crime scene was laced with the kind of fury that only someone close to the victims could unleash, and Pittman's history of threats, his erratic state of mind, and his proximity to the home that night gave prosecutors all they needed to push forward. Within weeks, Pittman was formally charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder for the Gantz family's surviving relatives. His arrest was both a relief and a bitter reminder of what they had lost. Justice was beginning to take shape, but no amount of evidence, no courtroom trial, could erase the images of what had happened in that house. For detectives, the case became a textbook example of how rage can blind a killer to the mistakes that ultimately lead to their capture. Pittman thought he had exacted vengeance, but what he had really done was write his own death warrant with every move he made. By the spring of 1991, the quiet community of Bartow, Florida, had turned its eyes toward the courthouse. The murders of Bob and Lillian Gantz and their daughter Sherry Booth had shattered not only one family, but the entire town. Now, the man accused of the brutal killings, David Joseph Pittman, was about to stand trial. For the victims' relatives, it was a chance to see justice delivered. For Pittman, it was his last hope of escaping the ultimate punishment. The prosecution wasted no time in building its case. They painted Pittman as a man consumed by rage, unwilling to accept the collapse of his marriage. In their telling, he wasn't just lashing out in the heat of the moment. He had acted with purpose, with intent, and with a chilling determination to make the Gans family suffer. They introduced evidence placing him near the crime scene, and forensic findings that linked him to the house. Most damning, however, were the stories from friends and neighbors who recalled Pittman's angry threats. In the weeks before the murders, each testimony added weight to the picture of a man spiraling out of control. Driven to the brink by his own pride, the defense fought to counter this narrative, trying to shift focus onto the weaknesses in the investigation. They argued there was no clear eyewitness, no definitive proof that Pittman alone had committed the killings. At times, they hinted that the case was built on assumptions and circumstantial evidence. Yet, as the trial unfolded, the brutality of the crime overshadowed these arguments. The sheer savagery of the attacks suggested more than a passing altercation. It suggested deep hatred, and that hatred fit only one man, David Pittman. As the trial neared its end, jurors sat in silence as photographs of the crime scene were shown. The images were haunting, and the courtroom felt the weight of every detail. It was not just the deaths of 3 people they were considering, but the sheer inhumanity of the way those deaths had been delivered. The prosecution argued this was exactly why Pittman deserved the harshest penalty available, death. After deliberating, the jury returned with its decision guilty on all 3 counts of first-degree murder. The verdict was read aloud, and the air in the courtroom grew heavy. Some family members wept quietly, others clutched each other for strength. Pittman sat motionless, his expression unreadable, as the reality of his fate closed in. The judge then delivered the sentence. With deliberate words, he declared that the brutality of the crime left no other option but the death penalty. Pittman was to be executed by the state of Florida. In that moment, the path of his life shifted forever. What had begun as rage inside a broken marriage now ended with a condemned man being led away in shackles, bound for a future on death row. For the Gans family's survivors, the sentence was a measure of justice, but not closure. The pain of losing 3 loved ones could not be erased by a verdict, no matter how final. For the state, it was a reminder of the devastating cost of unchecked anger. And for Pittman, it marked the beginning of a long, lonely countdown toward his eventual execution. After his sentencing, David Joseph Pittman was transferred to Florida's death row, where he would spend the next 3 decades in isolation, confined to a small cell for the majority of his life. The passage of time did little to change the reality of his situation. Behind the thick walls and barred doors, Pittman faced the slow, grinding weight of justice waiting to be carried out. Day after day, he lived with the consequences of his rage, forced to confront the reality that he had destroyed the lives of 3 people who had once been his family. Prison life on death row is monotonous and cruel in its quiet. Hours stretch into days, days into years, and for Pittman, every sunrise and sunset was a reminder that he could never undo what he had done. During his time in confinement, Pittman filed appeals, hoping to challenge his conviction or delay his execution. But year after year, his efforts were met with rejection. Legal reviews confirmed the strength of the evidence against him. The witnesses, the forensic proof, the pattern of threats, and the state affirmed the original sentence. Meanwhile, the families of Bob and Lillian Gans and Sherry Booth waited, haunted by memories of that fateful night, knowing that justice had been formally recognized, even if it took decades to carry out. Finally, in 2025, after more than 35 years behind bars, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed Pittman's death warrant. His execution date was set for September 17th at 6 p.m., a grim milestone marking the end of his long stay on death row. In accordance with tradition, Pittman was allowed to request a last meal and speak his final words before the lethal injection. His choices reflected the simplicity and, perhaps, resignation of a man who had lived decades facing the weight of his own guilt. For his last meal, Pittman requested fried chicken, mashed potatoes, and pecan pie, complicated, ordinary foods that contrasted sharply with the extraordinary violence of his crime. When it came time for his final statement, Pittman's voice trembled as he faced those gathered in the execution chamber. He said, "I'm sorry for the pain I caused. I can't change the past, but I hope my death brings peace." There was no bravado, no last-minute defiance, just a quiet acknowledgement of the lives he had destroyed and the inevitability of his own fate. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of decades spent reflecting on his actions. For the Gans family, the apology came too late. For the state, it was the final act in a legal process that had taken more than 3 decades to complete. David Joseph Pittman's time on death row was more than a period of waiting. It was a stark, unflinching confrontation with the consequences of anger, pride, and obsession. It was a life contained in small spaces, measured in years rather than milestones, and defined by the knowledge that his actions had, irrevocably, altered countless lives. And when the needle was prepared, and the execution carried out, his story born of rage, revenge, and family betrayal came to its final, irrevocable close. After more than 2 decades on death row, Chadwick D. Banks faced the finality of his sentence at Florida State Prison in Rayford, one of the nation's most feared penitentiaries. For some, justice had finally been served. For others, no punishment could ever restore what was lost. The case had haunted Gadsden County for decades, leaving a scar that refused to fade, a stark reminder of a night that had turned ordinary lives into an unfathomable tragedy. The night of September 24, 1992, but within a modest house on a tree-lined street, the ordinary would be violently ripped away. The first 911 call shattered the silence. There are 2 bodies, my neighbor and her daughter. In an instant, lives once filled with normalcy became etched in the public consciousness. Symbols of innocence destroyed. Cassandra Banks, Chadwick's wife, was asleep, unaware of the nightmare about to unfold. She had lived a simple life, quietly weaving the fabric of a small-town existence. Melody Cooper, Chadwick's 10-year-old stepdaughter, shared the same home, a child whose world was defined by laughter, homework, and bedtime stories. She could not have imagined that the sanctuary of her room would turn into the setting of her final hours. Together, mother and daughter represented the quiet beauty of family life, bonds formed in simplicity and trust. Neither had any reason to expect that their ordinary night would erupt into horror. As the early morning shadows stretched across Gadsden County, the nation remained preoccupied. Television screens flickered with news of Hurricane Andrew's destruction in South Florida, while presidential campaigns between George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton dominated headlines. But in that small, unassuming house, a different story was unfolding, one that would not make front-page news for its political or natural significance, but for the sheer cruelty that had invaded the lives of 2 innocent souls. That night, the calm of the neighborhood was brutally interrupted. It was not an isolated moment of anger or a crime of opportunity. This was a meticulously destructive act that left an indelible mark on a family and the community around them. Cassandra and Melody were silenced forever, their absence felt in every corner of the town and in every retelling of that dark September night. In the quiet of a small mobile home, night had settled like a soft, protective blanket. Inside, Cassandra Banks and her 10-year-old stepdaughter, Melody, slept unaware of the darkness that was about to descend. There was no hint of danger, no sound to disturb the stillness of the night. Outside, the world was calm, the air thick, with the silence of a typical, unremarkable evening in a small town. But inside, chaos waited in human form. Chadwick Banks, just 21, returned from an evening of drinking and pool at a local bar. His life, already marked by recklessness and impulsive choices, carried a darkness that would erupt violently that night. He moved through the home without announcement, his steps quiet, precise, calculated. He knew where they were, and he knew that the peace of the night was about to be shattered. At around 3 in the morning, he entered Cassandra's bedroom. There was no argument, no warning, nothing to hint at the horror that would unfold. A single gunshot rang out in the confined space, echoing through the walls, tearing through the stillness like a scream. Cassandra's life ended instantly, her body collapsing into the bed that had been her sanctuary. She never saw it coming. Her final moment was one of unbroken sleep, a quiet before the storm. The nightmare did not end there. Banks moved silently to the room where Melody lay sleeping, her small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm, oblivious to the horror next door. He woke her, and for nearly 20 minutes he inflicted unspeakable violence upon the child. The ordeal ended with a gunshot to the head, a life extinguished in a place that should have been safest. A child murdered in her own bed. The house meant to protect became a tomb. When the silence returned to the neighborhood, it was eerie and hollow. Inside, 2 lifeless bodies lay in the aftermath of unimaginable brutality. In a matter of minutes, Banks had erased 2 lives, leaving behind a wound that would scar a community forever. The normal rhythm of the small county was shattered, replaced by disbelief, grief, and an inescapable sense of horror. Morning brought no relief. The quiet that had blanketed the home through the night was replaced by the harsh reality of discovery. The absence of 911 calls only deepened the shock. The world had learned of the atrocity after the fact. Officers, even those familiar with the darkest aspects of human behavior, were struck by the sheer cruelty of what had occurred. Cassandra lay still, the victim of a close-range gunshot while asleep. In another room, Melody had suffered beyond comprehension, the innocence of her life stolen violently and abruptly. The small home, once a haven, had become a chamber of nightmare. The lives of a mother and her child, ordinary and unremarkable, had been obliterated in the span of a few cruel minutes. The officers who entered the mobile home described a scene of absolute devastation. Every corner of the house whispered the brutality that had unfolded, a violence executed in the supposed sanctuary of a family home. There was no forced entry, no signs of robbery, no shadowy figure lurking outside. Everything pointed inward, towards someone who knew the household intimately. The investigators' eyes immediately turned to Chadwick Banks, Cassandra's husband, whose presence in the home and relationship with the victims framed the first threads of the investigation. Neighbors confirmed the details that would later become crucial. Banks had been out drinking, playing pool at the local bar, and returned in the early hours of the morning. That timeline became the skeleton around which the police began reconstructing the night's horrors. Within mere hours, the investigation honed in on a single truth. This crime was personal. When Banks was brought in for questioning, the shadows of uncertainty vanished. Court records reveal a chilling confession. He admitted to shooting his wife, Cassandra, and ending the life of his 10-year-old stepdaughter, Melody. There were no lingering doubts, no distant suspects. The confession closed the circle of speculation, but it could not pierce the incomprehensible question haunting everyone. Why? For the family, for the neighbors, for the entire community, the answer offered no solace. 2 lives had been annihilated in a few brutal moments, and the calm of the small Florida town had been shattered forever. Investigators meticulously gathered evidence, cataloging every detail. Ballistics tests confirmed that the weapon used belonged to Banks himself. There were no third-party actors, no contradictory witness statements, only the stark reality of a man who had turned his own home into a scene of destruction. Each piece of evidence reinforced the terrible truth. The person entrusted to protect had instead obliterated. Within days, the case had a face, a name, and a story that would not be forgotten. Chadwick Banks, once husband and stepfather, became the embodiment of betrayal and cruelty. His confession, paired with the irrefutable physical evidence, propelled the case forward with undeniable force. There was no turning back. In the months that followed, Florida prosecutors filed the gravest charges the law allowed. First-degree murder for Melody, second-degree murder for Cassandra, and additional counts reflecting the sheer cruelty of the attack. The trial, held in 1994, was tense and emotionally charged. The courtroom brimmed with relatives seeking answers, desperate for some understanding of the incomprehensible. For the prosecution, the trial was not about proving who committed the crime. Banks had already admitted that, but about illuminating the horror of his actions. The case painted him as methodical, deliberate, and fully aware. This was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was a conscious, irreversible series of decisions, an evening of drinking and games, followed by a calculated return to the home he was meant to protect, culminating in the destruction of 2 innocent lives. In the courtroom, the prosecution laid out the story with meticulous precision. Forensic reports were presented, ballistic analyses explained in chilling detail, and the investigators who had entered the house described the devastation they encountered that night. Every piece of evidence pointed unerringly in one direction, toward Chadwick Banks. The crime had been deliberate, calculated, and brutal. The defense attempted to counter with arguments aimed at humanizing Banks, painting him as a young man, overwhelmed by alcohol and circumstance. They suggested that he had acted without full control, that personal struggles might temper the judgment he faced. Yet, the evidence was a relentless tide against these claims. Every report, Every witness, every ballistic test, reinforced the gravity of his actions. The horror of the murders, the killing of a child in her own bed, the execution of a mother in the quiet of night, overwhelmed any attempt at mitigation. The process had been legal and the sentence would stand. By 2014, more than 20 years after the crime, the defense made one last move. They asked for a stay of execution and filed appeals with the United States Supreme Court. None were successful. Just hours before the scheduled execution, the federal court denied the final request. On September 22, 2014, Governor Rick Scott signed the death warrant. It was the final step that set the countdown in motion. From that moment, every appeal filed by the defense was denied quickly. His time on death row was coming to an end. During those 22 years, little was known about Banks's daily life in prison. He lived in the section reserved for death row inmates under the isolation typical of such sentences. He gave no interviews and attracted no media spotlight. His name only reappeared when another appeal was denied or when the execution date drew closer. The judicial record shows a constant pattern: appeals denied, clemency requests that never gained traction, and an ending that seemed inevitable from the start. With each ruling against him, the shadow of the execution chamber loomed larger. After more than 2 decades on death row, Chadwick Banks had no escape left. The order was signed, and the date was set. The countdown had begun. It ended on the evening of November 13th, 2014. Chadwick D. Banks was moved from his death row cell to the execution chamber at Florida State Prison in Rafford. 22 years had passed since that September night when his home became the scene of a crime that would haunt the community forever. Now, the sentence that had followed him for over 2 decades was about to be carried out. The order, signed by Governor Rick Scott, left no room for delay. The last defense motions had been denied only hours earlier, including an appeal to the United States Supreme Court. Banks had no way out. The procedure would be performed by lethal injection using a 3-drug cocktail, beginning with midazolam, a sedative that at the time was the subject of controversy because of concerns about its effectiveness. In his final hours, Banks was offered the chance to choose a last meal. His request was officially recorded: fried fish, French fries, hush puppies, the small fried cornmeal bites common in the South, and 3 different desserts, a choice that seemed more like simple comfort food than a solemn farewell. The chamber was filled with official witnesses, members of the press, and relatives of the victims. Among them was Cassandra's mother, who had waited more than 20 years for the sentence to be fulfilled. From her seat, she watched every minute of the procedure with a grief that time had never erased. When it was over, she said she had waited for justice, but nothing could ever bring back her daughter and granddaughter. When the moment came to speak, Banks gave his final statement. He did not attempt to justify himself or offer legal explanations. His last words were recorded in the official reports. Year after year, I've tried to come up with a reasonable answer for my actions, but how could such acts be reasonable? Year after year, he said, he had tried to find a reasonable explanation for what he had done, but he understood that there was none. At 7:27 p.m., the medical team confirmed his death. The sentence had been carried out. Chadwick Banks's name was removed from Florida's death row, and the case was closed in the state's prison records. For some, it marked the end of a process that had dragged on too long. For others, it was a reminder that justice, even when delivered, can never erase the pain of absence. What is certain is that after 22 years, the story that began in the early hours of September 1992 reached its final chapter on a cold gurney in Rafford. Cassandra Banks and Melody Cooper never woke up that night. In September 1992, a mother and a daughter, whose story was defined by brutal violence. 22 years later, Florida's justice system carried out the sentence, but nothing could erase the void they left behind. The execution of Chadwick D. Banks closed a judicial chapter, but opened a question that still divides society. How much does the death penalty really repair the irreparable? For some, the enforcement of the sentence meant long-awaited closure. For others, it only confirmed that no punishment can ever bring back the lives that were taken. What cannot be disputed is the suffering of the victims and the echo of their absence. Cassandra was a wife, resting in her own home. Melody, a 10-year-old girl who should have grown up with her innocence intact. To remember them is to understand the true dimension of this tragedy. Has justice been served? That you must decide. Please comment if this story impacted you and leave a like to support the channel. You can find more cases like this and even darker ones by clicking on the screen. Thank you for watching until the end. This was Final Sentence. It was the evening of March 27, 1997. Behind the counter stood 33-year-old Margaret Parrish Bry, a woman known for her easy smile and polite manner. It was another late-night shift, one of countless she had worked before. To Margaret, this was routine. To Fate, it was the beginning of her final hours. Margaret wasn't rich, she wasn't famous, and she wasn't involved in anything dangerous. She was an ordinary woman doing an ordinary job. Yet on this night, she would cross paths with a man whose desperation turned deadly. That man was Jeffrey Todd West, a 21-year-old with a reputation in town. Recently paroled, West was already on a downward spiral. He was addicted to drugs cravings that demanded money, no matter the cost, and West knew exactly where to find it. Harold's Chevron wasn't just any gas station to him. He had once worked there. He knew the ins and outs of the store, the quiet hum of the refrigerators, the placement of the cash register, but most importantly, he remembered something most customers never knew existed: a cookie jar behind the counter, filled with about $200 in cash. It was a detail that had lodged itself in his memory, waiting for the moment he might need it. That moment had now arrived. But West wasn't just thinking about robbery. He had been caught, before recognized, arrested, convicted. He told people openly that this time, things would be different. This time, there would be no witnesses. Late that evening, West convinced his girlfriend, Amy Pierce, to drive him to Harold's Chevron. Amy knew what he intended to do. She said nothing, her silence acting as complicity. Together, they pulled into the dimly lit parking lot. Margaret was inside, likely unaware of the storm about to crash through the door. West stepped out of the car, the weight of a .45 caliber handgun heavy in his grip. For him, this wasn't just a robbery, it was survival. For Margaret, it was a death sentence she never saw coming. The clock inside Harold's Chevron ticked past 11 o'clock p.m., meant to Margaret Parrish Bry. It probably seemed like another late-night customer, maybe someone stopping for gas or a quick pack of cigarettes. But the man who entered wasn't here to buy, he was here to take. Jeffrey Todd West moved with purpose. In his hand, hidden but ready, was a .45 caliber handgun. Behind him, outside in the car, Amy Pierce waited nervously. She knew what he planned to do, but she couldn't stop it. Her silence was its own crime. Margaret stood behind the counter, her eyes meeting West's. Perhaps she recognized him. After all, he had once worked here. Maybe she thought he was just stopping by to say hello. But the truth revealed itself almost immediately. West raised the gun, his voice cold and commanding. "Get down," he ordered. Fear must have surged through Margaret, but she complied. Slowly, she lowered herself to the floor, her palms pressed against the cold tile, her cheek against the ground. She was defenseless, vulnerable, praying silently that obedience might keep her alive. West stepped behind the counter, his eyes darting too. The cookie jar he remembered so well. Inside was the $200 in cash. He craved money that would soon vanish into drugs. He grabbed the bills quickly, shoving them into his pocket. For a brief second, Margaret might have believed it was over, that once he had the money, he would leave. But West had already made up his mind long before entering the store. He had told people he wouldn't take any more chances. There would be no witnesses this time. Without warning, he leveled the gun at the back of Margaret's head. One deafening shot rang out, cutting through the silence of the night. The bullet struck with brutal finality. Margaret's body went still, her life ending instantly on the floor she had been ordered to lie upon. The gas station, once filled with the quiet hum of refrigerators and fluorescent lights, was now a crime scene. Blood stained the tiles, the faint smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. West stood over the lifeless body of the woman who had once been his co-worker. To him, she was no longer a person. She was an obstacle removed. Clutching the stolen cash, he hurried out the door, climbed into Amy's car, and vanished into the Alabama night. For Margaret's family, The clock had stopped forever. For Wes, it had just begun ticking toward justice, a countdown he could not escape. The morning after the murder, Atala awoke to shocking news. A gas station clerk had been executed, inside her own workplace. Police cars surrounded Harold's Chevron, their flashing lights casting eerie reflections on the windows. Yellow tape sealed off the entrance. Inside, investigators walked carefully across the cold tile floor, where Margaret Parish Bry's body still lay, the single gunshot wound leaving no doubt about how she had died. Detectives began piecing the scene together. The register wasn't touched, the cigarettes, the lottery tickets, the shelves all untouched. But the cookie jar behind the counter was empty. Whoever killed Margaret had known exactly where to look. That detail, though chilling, gave investigators their first lead. Word spread quickly through town, and whispers began to reach police ears. Locals recalled hearing Jeffrey Todd, Wes bragging about hitting Harold's Chevron. Some even remembered him saying the words, "That would haunt the case. This time, there won't be any witnesses." Detectives had heard West's name before. He wasn't a stranger to crime. He had a history of robberies and was out on parole. But suspicions alone wouldn't be enough. They needed evidence. That evidence came from an unexpected source, Simi Pierce, West's girlfriend. Under the weight of questioning, her story began to unravel. Nervous, guilt-ridden, and trapped by inconsistencies, Amy eventually admitted what police had already begun to suspect. She had driven West to Harold's Chevron that night, knowing full well what he intended to do. Her confession placed West at the scene, but more than that, it gave police the inside track. They now knew the weapon, a .45 caliber handgun, and they knew West had been desperate for drug money. Witnesses added to the puzzle, confirming West's reckless bragging after the crime. He had spoken too freely, telling acquaintances he had robbed the store and that Margaret wouldn't be testifying against him. With Amy's confession and witness testimony in hand, investigators secured a warrant. Within days, police closed in. The arrest was swift. Jeffrey Todd West was taken into custody, charged with capital murder and robbery. For Margaret's family, it was a small measure of relief. The man who had so casually stolen her life was finally behind bars, but the path from arrest to justice was far from over. When Jeffrey Todd West entered the courtroom, the air was thick with tension. Families of both the victim and the accused filled the benches, their lives forever altered by what had happened inside Harold's Chevron. At the center sat West, only 21 years old, but already carrying the weight of a decision that would decide whether he lived or died. The prosecution wasted no time painting the crime for what it was, a cold-blooded execution. They laid out the timeline with precision. West hadn't stumbled into the gas station in a fit of rage or panic. He had planned it. He knew about the cookie jar of cash, because he had once worked there. He carried a loaded .45 caliber handgun, because he intended not only to rob, but to kill. And he had told people beforehand that this time, no one would live to identify him. They played on the sheer cruelty of Margaret's death. She had followed his orders. She lay face down on the floor, helpless. She posed no threat, offered no resistance, and still, West pressed the gun to her head and pulled the trigger. The act, the prosecutor argued, was not desperation, it was calculation. Then came the witnesses, friends, acquaintances, and eventually his girlfriend, Amy Pierce, took the stand. Amy's testimony sealed his fate. With a trembling voice, she admitted to driving him there that night. She admitted she knew what he planned to do, and she admitted that when he returned to the car, he carried cash and the stench of gunpowder on his hands. The defense tried to cast West as a victim of circumstance, a young man destroyed by drugs, trapped in the cycle of addiction, not fully in control of his actions. They spoke of second chances, of rehabilitation, but in the eyes of the jury, drugs were not an excuse for execution-style murder. It took only hours of deliberation before the verdict came down. Guilty of capital murder and robbery. The sentencing phase was brutal. The prosecution argued that West's crime fit the very definition of Alabama's death penalty statute: deliberate, calculated, and committed during the course of a robbery. Margaret had been executed for no reason other than convenience. The jury agreed. Jeffrey Todd West was sentenced to death. As the gavel struck, Margaret's family wept not with joy, but with the heavy relief that justice, in some form, had been delivered. Across the aisle, West's family collapsed under the reality. that the son they once knew was now condemned to die. But while the sentence was clear, the road to execution would be long. Appeals, motions, and years of waiting stretched ahead. For over 2 decades, West sat in a cell on Alabama's death row, time crawling forward toward the inevitable. And when that day finally arrived, September 25, 2025, the world would once again turn its eyes to Jeffrey Todd West.